Welcome everyone to this session of the Canada-US Reset on Trade. My name is Dan Kisselback. I'm a lawyer with Miller Thomson, based out of Vancouver, and with me is my co-host, Dave Pentland. He's a VP with Carson International and experienced customs broker, and we work together quite frequently on customs matters. Today we're going to talk about what we see in the future with respect to Canada-US relations and how the trade issues of the day will be likely dealt with going forward. This, of course, is not legal advice, and we have to say that if you need legal advice, please consult an experienced lawyer. This is just background information. On to the next. So Dave, a little bit about Dave. Maybe you can tell folks that don't already know who you are and what you're up to these days.
Yeah, so thanks, Dan. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and listening to some of our comments about the reset on Canada-US trade relations. I'm a licensed Canadian customs broker. Our firm is located head office in Vancouver, offices in Toronto, Montreal, and Blaine, Washington. So we're both a Canadian and US customs broker. I've got 35 plus years experience in customs matters, and I'm always thrilled to co-host these with Dan and lean on him on his experience, and look forward to today's topic, and I hope everybody finds it interesting.
Next slide, Sutinu. Myself, I lead the trade and customs practice at Miller Thomson, and I've been practicing in this area for about 30 years. So I work with a team across the country dealing with import and export issues. And now I'm dual licensed, licensed in Canada and the US to practice law. So it'll be an even more great adventure going forward. So my trusted and able assistant, Satinder Baines, I think put this in here, a quotation: "People are very open-minded about new things as long as they're exactly like the old ones." And that seems to be pretty applicable here. President Biden, US President Biden seems to be very open to a rethink on trade, stating in a recent speech that every action we take must be with American families in mind. And so the slogan for the US right now is "Build Back Better." A focus on trade policy that helps Americans grow their economy and create jobs, and keeps in mind that the economy supports workers. But he's presented with a dilemma, having chosen between two often competing options, wanting to support workers, as I mentioned, and wanting to reassert economic alliances abroad. And although the first option, supporting workers at home, might call for greater protectionism, the option of trying to reassert economic alliances abroad may lead the US towards entering into arrangements that are trade facilitation in nature and might reduce trade or tariff barriers that have been put in place by the Trump administration. So in some ways, the new administration may look like the old one. Going forward with the Biden administration trade policies, there was an emphasis on multilateralism during President Obama, and then President Trump decided that that was not the way to go, that bilateral agreements were more effective. And so there was a trend towards moving away from the World Trade Order that the US helped create. There is also more now an emphasis on China's trade practice, and that also occurred under President Trump. It's a continuation of the policies dealing with trade practices intellectual property protection, market access restriction, forced labor is a concern, and censorship. Those issues haven't gone away. They're going to maybe heat up even. And the Biden administration is going to continue dealing with them on a go-forward basis once the current domestic issues relevant to the pandemic are dealt with. Building back better relationships with allies is, as I mentioned, an important issue. President Biden has echoed his promise to repair alliances through diplomacy and restore Washington's leadership position in the global stage, greater participation in the WTO. And he said, America's back and diplomacy is back. So a greater emphasis on diplomacy, and we should see a greater emphasis on reclaiming the moral high ground in trade. Canada-US trade relationships are, of course, extensive given our shared border and close cultural and economic ties. You know, Canada and US share have often emphasized their close relationship. There's an inscription on the side of the Peace Arch which reads, "Children of a common mother," referring to the two nations' common origin from the British Empire. And on the Canadian side, it says, "Brethren dwelling in unity." So that's what our aspirational ideals are, respecting our relationship concerning trade and other matters. And that's going to remain the same. Canada is the US's largest customer. It's a top trading partner, and for 35 states, I believe, Canada is the largest customer, and the US is Canada's largest customer. So there is a large number of jobs that are at stake for the US, and there will be an interest in maintaining this relationship and continuing and growing this relationship for the purpose of building back better and improving the job situation. Well, the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement, we see that the trade team for President Biden is stacked with individuals who were key in crafting the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. What's it called in Mexico, Dave? TMEC?
TMEC, yes.
Really agree on what it is. It's CUSMA in Canada. So we have three different ways of saying the same thing. There is a new U.S. trade representative, Ms. Tai. She was the chief trade lawyer who helped with labor provisions in the negotiation of CUSMA. And she's already made some statements with respect to the enforcement of the trade agreement. So there are some issues, and we'll delve into them shortly, that haven't been resolved as a result of this agreement. And those trade irritants haven't gone away, and they're likely not going to go away right away. And those include, the agriculture issues, tariff rate quotas on US agriculture goods coming into Canada, softwood lumber. To some extent, there's some concern about aluminum and steel tariffs and so forth. So those things haven't gone away. I should pause to note that there's something called the National Trade Estimate Report on Foreign Trade Barriers, NTE, and it is an annual series of surveys that discuss significant foreign barriers to US exports. So Canada is always on the list, and so are many other countries, with respect to issues. And this report provides estimates of the impact of certain foreign practices on the value of US exports. And it routinely mentions, for example, the Canadian dairy industry and the lack of access to the Canadian market for dairy because of Canada's supply management system. So if you are interested, you think that your industry might be the subject of a target, you can go to the National Trade Estimate Report and take a look at what are the key priorities for the US government. The current one for the current year is not out yet, of course, but you can see what happened in the last year. And if the irritants have not already been solved, we can expect those same irritants to be mentioned in the current report. Any comments about softwood lumber or the supply management system, Dave? Are you seeing a lot of those types of issues going forward, or are they just things are percolating along?
I mean, the biggest issue is really the opening up of our tariff rate quotas. So, you know, as a consumer in Canada, we're affected because these quotas are meant to force the limited amount of quantities, and I'm talking on the dairy, cheese, those type of products, to force Canadians to buy those products, and that's what the U.S. is upset about. So we're getting lots of inquiries that, you know, it was touted that when CUSMA or the USMCA was put into effect, that magically the border would be open and U.S. would be granted access. Well, that's not the case. You know, it's very, very structured opening. And so I guess to give it some context, you know, the quotas, for example, on cheese, you know, the annual quota is about 22 million kilograms of cheese that are allowed in. And when it's under quota, it's very limited duty rates, you know, 0 to 3%. But if you exceed the quota, the duty goes to 245%. And so that kind of forces a finite number, and that's what the U.S. is pushing on. So I'll give you a little bit of context on the quotas. So.
Yeah, we typically get involved if there is an issue with respect to classification or misclassification, in the sense that sometimes the CBSA will do a post-importation verification, and then they will determine, oh, well, the importer misclassified goods. They should have classified it in another category that requires, you know, a permit. It's under a tariff-free quota, and so if you don't have the permit, you're up to 300% duty. Yogurt, cheese, eggs, meat, that kind of stuff. And so then the issue is, can you get a retroactive permit, and can you solve the issue, or what is the in questioning the classification decision. So we see that area as being a continual area where people get caught up as importers into the country. I just pause to note that in October of last year, the International Dairy Foods Association in the U.S. Made submissions to the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, with respect to Canada's barriers for U.S. exports, and we will expect to see that in 2021. So there is as well the issue of the U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Canada Free Trade Agreement Buy American issues. There is an order that was issued, an executive order issued by President Biden, which directs agencies to close loopholes in how made in America products are measured, and so that they can close loopholes and increase the amount of product that must be made in the U.S. In order for it to qualify under the Buy American law. And the Buy American law deals with primarily procurement, government procurement contracts. So if you're engaged in the export of goods into the US and you want to take advantage of a US contract, you're likely going to run into these Buy American laws and provisions. So President Biden's also setting up a Made in America office under the White House Office of Management and Budget, and is taking steps to appoint a senior official to ensure that the rules are actually enforced. So this plan will increase the amount of US content a project needs in order to qualify as being made in America, and there will be an application more stringent standards to the exceptions that Canada has historically enjoyed to similar rules that were imposed by the Obama administration. The Canadian response is that we know how to deal with US protectionism. That remains to be seen. Hopefully that's the case. To give you a sense of the order of magnitude, 2019 US government report stated that 290 billion in contracts were issued in the US, and Canadian firms got about, $750 million of those contracts. On to the next slide. Yeah, we've talked about that as well. Supply management, we've discussed a little bit about supply management. Supply management is Canada's system for maintaining a constant and continuous and predictable supply for certain markets of certain agricultural goods. It is said to be advantageous to the farmers and as well to Canadian consumers, and it ensures the viability of the Canadian agriculture industry. And part of the supply chain, supply management system is a tariff wall. If you want to import certain goods into the country, you can import them under a permit system under which you can get an allocation to import to a certain level, an allocation quota, and over which, if you import, then there are punitive duties up to 300 and some odd %, which make it not economical to continue on business over and beyond your quota. So President Biden signed an executive order to review supply chain issues, and supply management is really one aspect of this. But what the president has dealt with is really, in this executive order, supply chain, to make sure that medical goods and certain types of goods from an importation standpoint are consistent, and that the US is not in a position where it can't obtain important industrial goods, for example, or health and safety goods for its population because it doesn't generate them themselves. So there may be some onshoring of certain types of goods. We've seen in the past that there was no capacity to make simple things like masks and gloves. And so this has fallen on the heels of the pandemic, that the US administration has decided that there should be more resilience in the supply chain. And from an importation standpoint, from a US standpoint, there are key industries that should be looked at to make sure that there is adequate supply. Another industry from an importation standpoint is the car industry. There's been a lot of talk about chips and the unavailability of chips because of the lack of production in the United States, and that has caused problems for the automotive industry. So there will be a complete review of this particular issue with an interest on making the supply chain more resilient, and hopefully it will involve Canada as part of the revitalization effort. Dave, have you been seeing any of these types of issues?
Yeah, I mean, the two big issues that we run up, and most people are reading about it, is the United States is pretty firm on the vaccines for the coronavirus. They're going to inoculate Americans first, and so they're going to the supply chain will pretty much be limited coming into Canada until Americans have been inoculated, and then they'll get to their friendly neighbors to the north. And the other is on medical grade PPE masks. Again, you've seen that the Trump administration started, and Biden's continuing that they're going to satisfy their domestic needs first before anybody else, and this includes Canada. So that's what we're running into.
So the executive order is has directed year-long reviews for 6 sectors: defense, public health, information technology, transportation, energy, and food production. So there will be more on this particular issue going forward. The policies, supply chain policies, center on weaning the United States and allies off of China. There are certain geopolitical issues that are happening, of course, and from a historical standpoint, there has been a great rise in China's ability to be the manufacturer for the world. And the US has, during the Trump administration, focused in on that and has, in some respects, challenged China on certain practices. There are certain concerns about, for example, required technology transfers that US companies have to make if they want to do business in China. And so the US tariff war was an answer to some issues that arose, such as the forced technology transfers and issues such as that, as well as the concern that there was a hollowing out of the manufacturing base within the United States. So the policy will require a greater focus on making supply chains more efficient, and it may not just involve bringing back or reshoring manufacturing to US shores. The Canadian manufacturers and exporters has urged the federal government to work with the Biden administration to preserve Canadian manufacturers' access to the US government, or to the US government procurement market and elsewhere. So again, Canada wants a special carve out, and there's a kind of what I would describe as a theory of the North American fortress. That as a result of CUSMA, the USMCA or TMEC, a greater alliance between Mexico, Canada, and the US as a trading bloc and protection of supply chains within that trading bloc, and a focus on things like US Buy America, which the Canadians would like to have converted into Buy North America. So there is a focus on a North America approach rather than an American approach from Canada's perspective. I mentioned this, the CME believes the right path is to adopt a Buy North American plan. And this is because of the complex supply chain linkages on such things as autos. Auto parts have to transfer back and forth across boundaries sometimes 6 times before they end up as a finished product. And because of such great integration, the CME believes that it's better to adopt a Buy North American plan. The same goes for the folks in Mexico.
Yeah, my one comment would be to put some numbers to it. I mean, Michigan and Ontario are so intertwined in the automotive, completed automobiles, but also the parts. And I mean, Michigan last year totaled over $70 billion worth of, and that's 17% of all the US exports go from Michigan up into Ontario. And half of these exports are motor vehicles and parts. And I mean, the two countries are so bound together that it'd be a shame to try and separate the two entities, you know, when we've got a history that's going back 80 years of car production going back and forth. And you know, in some cases, these parts and automobiles being made in Mississauga, Ontario, and it's actually the part components of it is going into Canada, going back to the States and back and forth. So, you know, only brokers and people within that industry actually see the movement of those goods, but it's, you know, Canadians and Americans need to be more aware of how intertwined our industries are on our shared border. So.
Yes, on to the next slide, Satinder. Section 232 tariffs, this refers to 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 in the US. This provision allows the president to impose tariffs based upon recommendations made by the US Secretary of State if an article is being imported into the US in such quantities and under such circumstances as to threaten or impair national security. And so we heard a little bit about that when the aluminum and steel tariffs were imposed. There was a big hue and cry in Canada about how could Canadians cause a national security crisis in the US over aluminum and steel exports. So Canada was caught up in this until a solution was negotiated. Were you involved with that, David?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we had a number of our clients that are shipping to the States, and certainly they got wrapped up in it. And I mean, it eventually was resolved where they put quotas in place. So far, the quotas seem to be satisfying that Canadian manufacturers can supply the U.S. market. But I think it was their past administration who was just unaware of how the U.S. cannot produce enough aluminum, and that Canadian is a massive building block on products that they manufacture in the States that require Canadian aluminum. So they kind of lumped us in with cheaper aluminum coming in from China, Turkey, other places in the world. And so the quota system seems to have satisfied the parties right now. We'll see what happens when we exceed the quota. And I noted there you found out that the quota for November was 85,000 tons. It seems like a lot, but it's not a big quota. So we'll just see if that is can satisfy the U.S. marketplace. So.
Yeah, and in one of his first actions, President Biden reinstated a 10% duty on aluminum imports from the UAE. And so it's not gone away. This, I think what has happened in the US is there is a greater awareness that the US president has the ability to do things with the stroke of a pen, to change tariffs. And that is a lever that is turned out to be very useful. So there will be a continuation of this particular practice from time to time, if and when it is said to be useful. With respect to the tariffs in Canada, those were removed by President Trump after it was determined at first with respect to the USMCA, there was an agreement. And then secondly, there was a surge by Canadians into the US, Canadian aluminum in particular. That was resolved as a result of negotiations. And again, the tariff was reduced. But it can be imposed rather swiftly, and I would refer to it as a stroke of the pen risk for exporters into the US at this particular point in time. On to the next slide, please. I think we've dealt with that too. On to the next one, agriculture. A key industry. Manufacturing is 11% of the Canadian GDP, with about 1.7 million jobs at stake in Canada. But agriculture is as well a huge industry, an important industry for both sides of the border. So the total value of two-way trade is in the range of $50 billion. So there is an interest on both sides of the border to try to get along and try to deal with these agricultural issues. But the issues, there's several of them. There's softwood lumber, which kind of falls within agriculture. There's hard wheat and durum. And there's the compulsory country of origin labeling requirements, which were imposed on meat products, for example, that were imported into the US from Canada. So there are protectionist forces still at play within the US. They will continue to disrupt trade exporting into the US and possibly into Canada. But there have been signs in Canada, at least, of a greater intention to diversify and not be so reliant upon the US economy to be able to withstand any of these disruptions as and when they occur. Any thoughts on this, Dave?
I would just also point out that Canada and the US we're both pushing it came in with the labeling, but they're both pushing to understand more about what the consumers in their countries were actually consuming, and so a lot of goods were coming in with what the consumer believed was safe food practices from countries that may not always manufacture goods up to the same standards. So certainly in Canada, it was March 15th is an ominous date here because everybody has to supply or be covered under the Safe Food for Canadians Act if you're a food importer or a manufacturer. And in the States, the US FDA is taking steps to ensure that their food sources are being protected. So I think we're going to see a resurgence under the Biden administration that more North American sourcing of food, which may go a little against our looking at different markets for our food products. But I think as a consumer, you'll be satisfied that the goods are probably a little bit higher quality and less more in line with what our practices are within North America. So
Just one additional point, which is that the U.S. has accused Canada, of course, of unfairly limiting the ability of U.S. Dairy producers to sell their products in Canada, and they've made an official request for consultations to address Canada's limits. And this appears to be an initial step in the enforcement action under CUSMA or the USMCA. So stay tuned. There's going to be continued discussions, and this issue may heat up again. This complaint really comes as a little surprise because the U.S. Dairy Export Council set the table last June when it complained that Canada's TRQs deny farmers rightful access to markets. So the U.S. government is responding. Next slide. We talked a little bit about dairy and poultry exports. And the issue of diversification, which seems to be more important to Canada than the U.S. The U.S. is a greater market per market share than Canada is to the U.S. On to the next slide. Softwood lumber, of course, this is a 40-year dispute that hasn't gone away. And it's been played out in various fora, in various courts. And it's fundamentally a dispute between two industries, and the governments have been used as actors to try to resolve the disputes. So we do not anticipate any short-term solutions to this particular issue. The issue being the allegation that Canada unfairly subsidizes softwood lumber that is exported as products into the United States, and the response in the United States, which is being to slap on softwood lumber duties of various rates at particular points in time in order to deal with this so-called subsidy issue. Energy, we've seen President Biden's immediate decision, which was to revoke the presidential permit for Keystone XL, the pipeline, from Canada into the US, and a temporary ban on drilling it off federal lands. And that sends a clear message of what is to come from his administration with respect to energy policy. The Canadian government seems to agree with making climate change number one priority when it comes back to rebuilding the economy. So to some extent, the governments are aligned. There's no denying the tremendous momentum behind the movement to making the global economy greener and cleaner. The cancellation of the Keystone pipeline was a blow, but President Biden's decision to go full nuclear on his own oil industry may be of assistance to Canadian producers, and it may free up some market share for Canadian producers going forward. We expect that the demand for oil is going to continue for the next while, and things will continue on, but energy will be a focus for the Biden administration and the Trudeau government. But you have any comments there, David?
No, other than I think a lot of that seems to be politically motivated. I mean, everybody wants a greener environment, but it seems to be fueled the fact, I don't believe fossil fuel cars are just going to disappear. They will probably decrease, but in the short term, we'll need something to put in the tank of our vehicles. And so I think on both sides of the border, both Trudeau and Biden cautiously need to appease the electorate and get them on side. At the same time, we have to take steps towards protecting our environment. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're not just going to abandon our crude oil industry in Alberta. We probably use it more for domestic. So you may see a resurgence, and maybe we'll see some refineries setting up if that's possible, if there's some cash outlay within Canada to satisfy our market. So,
last slide, Satinder. China's trade practice. China is facing more opposition than ever due to its trade record, and there's territorial disputes and the crackdown in Hong Kong and reports of human rights abuses and accusation of forced technology transfers and theft and spying. So President Biden's administration is going to seem strikingly similar to the Trump administration in the sense of dealing with and acting upon these types of complaints. We will likely see a greater effort in a multilateral approach, gathering strength through allies, and Canada be one of those allies. The US-China trade war isn't going to go away under President Biden. President Biden wants to focus on the coronavirus and the economy first, but then he'll renew pressure over trade and technology grievances that prompted President Trump to hike tariffs on Chinese imports in 2017. So the Biden administration has recognized that to some extent the imposition of Chinese tariffs has worked. It's gotten a particular attention on the part of China, and it's forced a discussion on these issues. Whether or not it's successful is is for another day to discuss. So, in summary, I would like to say that in some ways, the Biden administration is going to look similar to the Trump administration insofar as the use of tariffs increased tariffs go. There'll likely be a movement towards greater multilateralism and bringing countries and allies into the fold rather than one-on-one bilateralism and approaches with individual countries. So the Trump era created an awareness of some of the issues caused by or connected with trade, and that was the hollowing out of manufacturing and the loss of jobs. And the Biden administration is going to continue to deal with those issues in its Build Back Better mantra and its approach to the economy. Any thoughts, David?
Yeah, I would say, in wrapping up, my personal belief is that the Buy American push by the Biden administration that's been, piggybacking on what President Trump started, I don't think we should fear it in Canada. I think we can actually look at molding it into a North American first mentality, and just with a few nudges from our U.S. counterparts and Mexican counterparts, and I think we're going to rebuild the friendship that may have been beaten up during the past administration, and I think it kind of goes to, there was an MP, a Canadian MP, Robert Thomas, said in the 60s, he once told the House of Commons, whether we like it or not, our Americans are our best friends. And so I think it's just a time to rebuild and pause. And I'm pretty optimistic on once we get through this pandemic, that I really believe that 2021 can be rebuilding. And then as long as during the midterms, US midterms, the Senate or Congress doesn't go back to a split, that I think 2022 will be a better year for both Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans. So.
Okay, folks, thank you for joining. I want to say thank you to my partner here, David Pentland, for his sage advice and wisdom. And I wish you a good day. I hope to see you at our next presentation on hot topics for global trade and customs. Thanks again, folks.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody.